What connects a respected doctor, a devoted father, a man who entertained children as a clown, someone who turned a trailer into a chamber of horrors, and a quiet Soviet citizen? On the surface, they seemed ordinary, people you might trust, even admire. But behind closed doors, they committed acts so unthinkable, so cruel, that their names are forever etched in history. The world watched as their crimes came to light. But what if I told you the media didn't tell us the whole story? What if some of what we've come to believe isn't the truth at all? Today, we're going to uncover what the headlines missed, the misconceptions that clouded the facts, and the truths you were never told. These 5 names became infamous, etched into history because of the horrors they left behind. The world reacted with shock, fear, and fascination as their crimes were revealed piece by piece through headlines and breaking news. But as the media told their stories, did it focus too much on what would sell, what would shock the audience, instead of the full truth? Did they overlook key details, simplify complex realities, or even distort the narrative altogether? Today, we're going beyond the surface. We'll explore what was said, what was left out, and what was misunderstood. From Harold Shipman, a trusted doctor whose actions defied belief, to David Parker Ray, whose crimes still leave unanswered questions, we'll examine what the media reported and the truth they missed along the way. By the end, you might see these infamous figures and their stories in a very different light. Harold Shipman was not just any doctor. For years, he was a trusted figure in his community, a man families turned to in their most vulnerable moments. A man whose presence was supposed to represent care, healing, and reassurance. But beneath that familiar exterior was a darkness no one could have imagined. By the time his crimes came to light, it was revealed that this one man, this doctor, had killed more than 200 of his patients, making him one of the deadliest serial killers in modern history. The media quickly latched onto the story, his methodical approach, the sheer scale of his crimes. It was all too horrifying to ignore. But as they built their narratives, calling him Dr. Death and later branding his suicide as a coward's way out, they left critical questions unanswered. How did one man operate undetected for so long? What systems allowed him to carry on, victim after victim, without anyone stepping in? And what about the families? What about the lives forever changed by his action? Even his death became a spectacle. Shipman hanged himself in his prison cell just one day before his 58th birthday. The headlines called him a coward, celebrating the fact that he was gone. But was it really that simple? His suicide wasn't just an escape from justice, it had a calculated purpose. By ending his life before turning 60, his wife was able to collect his full NHS pension, a financial security she wouldn't have received if he had lived longer. And there's more. During his time in prison, Shipman refused to take part in any rehabilitation programs or courses that would have forced him to admit to his crimes. He maintained his silence, even when his wife, the one person who had defended his innocence, began to doubt him. She wrote him a letter, asking him to tell her everything. But Shipman never responded. His refusal to confess left the families of his victims with unanswered questions. They were robbed of closure. They were robbed of justice. The media focused on the spectacle of his crimes and his death, but overlooked the institutional failures that allowed him to kill for so long. What checks and balances were missing in the healthcare system? How could so many deaths have gone unnoticed for years? The Shipman story isn't just about one man's crimes. It's about the systems that failed to stop him and the people left behind to pick up the pieces. And as horrifying as this story is, it's far from the only one of its kind. From a killer doctor to a man who turned his church into a facade, Dennis Rader's story is one of manipulation and deception. But it's what the media missed about him that might be the most shocking of all. Dennis Rader was the kind of man people trusted. He was a husband, a father, and a respected member of his church. He worked as a compliance officer in his community, enforcing rules and regulations with precision. On the surface, he seemed like an ordinary man, living a quiet life in Wichita, Kansas. But beneath that image was a secret so disturbing that, for nearly 2 decades, it would terrify an entire city. Rader was the BTK Killer, an acronym he gave himself, standing for Bind, Torture, Kill. It was not just a description of his crimes, but a twisted signature, a mark of the horror he left behind. The media quickly turned him into a figure of pure evil, branding him a monster. Stories focused on the shocking details of his crimes, the women he targeted, the way he bound and killed his victims, and the trophies he kept as reminders. But what they failed to highlight was how Rader's obsession with recognition became his undoing. Yes, his crimes were horrific, but the media's singular focus on his brutality missed the deeper, more unsettling truth about him. Rader wasn't just hiding in plain sight. He was actively building a double life, a persona that allowed him to evade capture for years. To the people who knew him, Rader was meticulous and controlling, traits he carried into both his work and his crimes. He lived for structure, for rules, and for the sense of power they gave him. At home, he was a family man. At church, he was a leader. And at night, he became something else entirely. His ability to wear these masks delayed justice, not because people were blind to his actions, but because they couldn't reconcile the image of the man they thought they knew with the monster he truly was. But there was another side to Rader that often went underreported, a side driven by his need for attention. Rader didn't just kill. He wanted police with cryptic letters describing his crimes in graphic detail. He sent clues to the media, confident in his ability to outsmart investigators. For years, he relished the fear he created, but it was this very need for recognition that led to his downfall. In 2004, more than a decade after his last known murder, Rader couldn't resist the urge to resurface. He sent a floppy disk to the police, hoping to reignite his infamy. What he didn't realize was that the disk contained metadata linking it directly to him. This mistake, born from his arrogance and his belief that he's untouchable, finally ended his reign of terror. While the media focused on his crimes, they often downplayed the chilling reality of his manipulation. Rader fooled his family, his neighbors, and even law enforcement, not just through his actions, but through the image he so carefully maintained. His ability to blend into his community wasn't just a tactic, it was his greatest weapon. As shocking as Rader's story is, it's not unique. He wasn't the first killer to hide behind a mask of normalcy, and he wouldn't be the last. While Rader sought fame, John Wayne Gacy used charm and charisma to disarm his victims, creating a facade that was far more dangerous than anyone realized. His story is next, and it's one that still haunts the world. John Wayne Gacy is a name that has become synonymous with one of the most horrifying chapters in true crime history. For many, the image of Gacy in clown makeup is unforgettable. A man who entertained children at parties, brought laughter to gatherings, and seemed to be a pillar of his community. But Gacy wasn't just a clown. Behind the painted smile was a man capable of unimaginable cruelty. Over the course of several years, he lured 33 young men and boys into his home, promising them jobs or favors, only to end their lives in brutal fashion. Most of his victims were buried in the crawl space beneath his house, a place that would later be described as a chamber of horrors. When Gacy's crimes came to light, the media was quick to latch on to the most sensational aspects of his story. They called him the Killer Clown, focusing on his performances and the chilling irony of his persona. The headlines emphasized the bizarre nature of his crimes, creating a narrative that was horrifying but incomplete. What they failed to address was how so many young men were able to vanish without anyone connecting the dots. How did Gacy, a man with a criminal past, manage to evade suspicion for so long? In 1968, Gacy had already been convicted of sodomy involving a teenage boy and sentenced to prison. He served just 18 months of a 10-year sentence before being released on parole. Despite this history, he was able to rebuild his life, remarry, and integrate himself back into the community. He became a successful businessman, actively involved in the vocal campaign, and for his age group, went on to become political. He had learned how to manipulate people, how to make them trust him, and he used this skill to mask his true nature. But there's another, more disturbing layer to this story. Many of Gacy's victims were young men and boys who were dismissed by society even before they disappeared. They were labeled as runaways, their cases given less attention than they deserved. The systemic biases of the time, the idea the young male victims were less likely to face danger, allowed Gacy to continue his crimes for years. Parents who reported their sons missing were often met with skepticism, told their children would likely return on their own. This negligence cost lives, and it gave Gacy the freedom to continue his horrific acts. Gacy's methods were chillingly deliberate. He would charm his victims, often with promises of work or opportunities, and then lure them into his home. Once inside, he would show them a pair of handcuffs, claiming it was part of a magic trick. By the time they realized the truth, it was already too late. He would torture them, kill them, and bury them beneath his house. Despite neighbors reporting strange smells and suspicions, it wasn't until the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Peast in 1978 that authorities finally began to investigate Gacy seriously. The media's focus on the killer clown overshadowed these critical failures. They painted Gacy as a larger-than-life figure, a monster hiding in plain sight, but they often ignored the signs that could have stopped him early. His charm, his charisma, and the blind trust of his community enabled his actions. And the systemic failures in treating missing boys as a priority only amplified the tragedy. Gacy's story is one that forces us to ask difficult questions, not just about him, but about the systems and attitudes that allowed his crimes to continue for so long. If Gacy's crimes were shocking because of how visible they eventually became, David Parker Ray's actions are the opposite. His crimes were hidden, concealed, in a way that still leaves questions unanswered. And his story is next. David Parker Ray is a name that doesn't always appear alongside the most infamous killers, but the crimes he committed are among the most horrifying in recent history. For decades, Ray preyed on women, luring them to a place he called the toy box. This wasn't an ordinary trailer. It was a meticulously outfitted torture chamber, designed with one purpose in mind: to inflict unimaginable pain and suffering. Inside, he kept tools, restraints, and recording devices, all carefully arranged to carry out his twisted plans. The things that happened there are almost too disturbing to describe. When Ray's crimes were finally uncovered, the media focused heavily on the gruesome details. They described the equipment he used, the recordings he made, and the chilling notes he left behind. But as shocking as these details were, the coverage failed to tell the full story. For years, Ray operated under the radar, his actions hidden in plain sight. How could someone commit such crimes year after year without being stopped? The media seldom addressed the deeper question: why weren't the missing women connected to him sooner? Ray didn't work alone either. He had accomplices, people who helped him carry out his crimes, who participated in or enabled the suffering of his victims. Among them were his partner Cindy Hendy and even his own daughter Glenda Jean Ray. Yet their roles were often overshadowed, downplayed, in favor of focusing on Ray himself. And what about the victims who survived? Many of them were left to pick up the pieces of their lives with little support, forced to carry the burden of memories that no one should ever have to bear. One of the most disturbing aspects of Ray's crimes was the way he tried to erase his victims' memories. He used powerful drugs, chemicals designed to make them forget the horrific things they had endured. After weeks or even months of captivity, he would abandon them by the side of a road, hoping they wouldn't remember enough to report what had happened. Some victims never came forward, either out of fear or because they couldn't fully recall the details. And then there were the women who never returned at all. Ray was suspected of killing as many as 60 people, yet no bodies were ever found. The lack of physical evidence meant he was never convicted of murder, only of kidnapping and torture. For all the horror of his crimes, the media rarely addressed the systemic failures that allowed him to operate for so long. Ray's victims were often women who were vulnerable, women who might not have been immediately missed or whose disappearances were dismissed. Authorities failed to connect the dots, failed to see the patterns that might have stopped him years earlier. The focus on Ray's methods, the shock value of the tools in the toy box, overshadowed the more pressing question: why wasn't he caught sooner? And how many lives might have been saved if the system had worked the way it should? Ray's story is one of secrets, silence, and unanswered questions. It forces us to confront not only the actions of a man who caused so much suffering, but also the ways in which his crimes were overlooked or ignored. And yet, his story is still not the most chilling of all. Finally, we turn to André Chikatilo, a man who operated in a world where misinformation wasn't just a failure of the system, it was a weapon of control. André Chikatilo. His name became synonymous with terror in the Soviet Union. Known as the Butcher of Rostov, Chikatilo confessed to the murders of 56 women and children, though the true number may never be known. Over a span of more than a decade, his crimes cast a dark shadow across the Soviet Union, spreading fear in towns and cities that were unprepared for the kind of horror he brought into their lives. But the story of André Chikatilo isn't just about what he did. It's about how he got away with it for so long. The media, heavily controlled by the state at the time, did not report on the full extent of his crimes. Instead, they framed the killings as a reflection of societal issues, as if the crimes themselves were the result of an environment rather than the work of one man. This was a time when the Soviet government wanted to project the image of a strong, stable society. To admit that a serial killer was roaming free, targeting women and children, would have been seen as a sign of weakness. Even when the truth became impossible to ignore, the focus of the media remained on the grotesque details of Chikatilo's methods. Details that shocked the public but overshadowed the deeper failures in the investigation. Innocent men were arrested, tortured, and even executed for crimes they didn't commit. The real killer, meanwhile, continued his rampage, often operating in plain sight. How could this have happened? How did a man with a history of troubling behavior manage to evade capture for so long? The answers lie in a system that was deeply flawed. Chikatilo's crimes weren't just overlooked, they were actively mismanaged. Investigators ignored evidence that could have connected him to the murders early on. Witnesses who described a man fitting his appearance were dismissed. Even when Chikatilo was briefly detained, his connection to the murders wasn't pursued because he didn't fit the profile authorities were working with. They were looking for someone else, someone who matched their idea of what a killer should be. Chikatilo himself knew how to exploit this chaos. He was quiet, unassuming, and lived a life that didn't draw attention. He used his knowledge of the system's weaknesses to his advantage, targeting victims who were less likely to be missed or whose disappearances wouldn't raise immediate alarms. In many cases, his victims were young, vulnerable, and without the means to fight back. He carried out his crimes with a sense of control that made him all the more dangerous. But the most disturbing part of this story isn't just the crimes. It's the denial, the refusal to acknowledge that a serial killer could exist in the Soviet Union allowed Chikatilo to operate far longer than he should have. It wasn't until 1990, more than a decade after his first known murder, that he was finally apprehended. By then, the damage had already been done. 56 lives were lost, countless families were destroyed, and an entire nation was left to reckon with the horrors of a man they had failed to stop. Chikatilo's story is one that forces us to confront not just the man himself, but the systems, the attitudes, and the narratives that enabled him. It's a story of denial, of missed opportunities, and of lives lost because the truth was too inconvenient to face. And yet, this is just one of many stories that reveal how the narratives built around these killers often obscure more than they reveal. These 5 stories, Harold Shipman, Dennis Rader, John Wayne Gacy, David Parker Ray, and Andrei Chikatilo, aren't just about the crimes. They're about the way the media shaped what we know, what we believe, and what we understand. They're about the truths that were left untold and the consequences of those omissions. And they leave us with one question. How many other stories have we only partially seen? How much of what we know is the full truth, and how much has been shaped by the headlines? Over the years, the stories of these killers have become infamous, shaping the way the world remembers their crimes. But how much of what we know is the truth, and how much has been filtered through the lens of sensational headlines? The media, in its rush to capture the public's attention, often focused on the most shocking and gruesome details. It gave us dramatic nicknames and narratives designed to horrify, yet in doing so, it often missed the deeper, more important truths. These stories were more than the actions of individuals. They were also the failures of the systems meant to protect people. Harold Shipman was able to exploit the trust placed in him as a doctor for years because of a lack of oversight. Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, hid behind his role as a family man and community leader, while his narcissism drove him to seek attention through his crimes. John Wayne Gacy's charming facade allowed him to lure victims, even as systemic biases dismissed missing boys as runaways. David Parker Ray operated in secrecy, his crimes concealed by the vulnerable status of his victims and the failures of those who should have connected the dots. And Andrei Chikatilo's reign of terror was prolonged by denial and mismanagement, with innocent men paying the price for his crimes. In each case, the focus on the killer's methods overshadowed the questions that needed to be asked. How did these individuals evade capture for so long? What systems failed to identify them earlier? And how did the portrayal of their stories affect the families left behind? For the victims' loved ones, the loss wasn't just the crime itself, it was also the lack of answers, the absence of justice, and the knowledge that the world would remember the killers more than the lives they destroyed. The media's approach shaped not only how we understand these crimes, but also how we feel about them. By focusing on the most dramatic aspects, it created narratives that were easy to sell but incomplete. These stories became larger than life, turning real events into almost mythological tales of horror. But in doing so, critical details were ignored, details that could have taught us how to prevent similar tragedies in the future. And so, we're left to wonder, how much of what we believe about these cases is grounded in fact, and how much has been shaped by the need to create compelling headlines? What other truths might have been overlooked, buried beneath the need to shock and captivate. The lives lost, the families devastated, the systems that failed. These are the pieces that don't always make the front page, but they are just as important. If we stop to look past the headlines, we might find a reality that is more complex, more unsettling, and more urgent than the stories we've been told. You've just heard the stories of 5 of the most notorious killers in history, but also the truths the headlines often missed. Their crimes shocked the world, their names became infamous, and their actions left a lasting impact on countless lives. But now, I want to hear from you. Which of these stories struck you the most? Was it the betrayal of trust by Harold Shipman, the calculated manipulations of Dennis Rader, the chilling double life of John Wayne Gacy, the horrors hidden away by David Parker Ray, or the systemic denial that allowed Andrei Chikatilo to evade capture for so long? If you found this video compelling, then I'd love to hear what you think. If you found this video compelling, make sure to subscribe. There are so many more stories waiting to be uncovered, so many truths that deserve to be told. By subscribing, you'll be the first to know when we release our next deep dive into infamous crimes and the questions they leave behind. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you don't miss a thing.